be recording today's event. Perfectly timed. Thank you, Nicole. And if you have any questions during the event, please feel free to use the chat. Nicole will be monitoring the chat today. If there are any questions in the chat that go unanswered, we will be copying the chat and working on answering those.
Blue cheese, walnuts, and squash.
We will be monitoring the chat, and we will be making a Q&A doc afterwards so that we can answer those questions after the event is done today. If time permits, we will have an open Q&A at the end of the session, but we're not sure if we will. We'll try our best. We want to do our land acknowledgement, very important. UW Worklife acknowledges that we live and work on the traditional territories of the Duwamish and Coastal Salish peoples, and that we occupy their land. While we recognize that this acknowledgement does not replace authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, we hope that it honors with gratitude the land and its original inhabitants. I'm going to hand it over to Ian. He's our manager of Disability Services Office, who will introduce our CART feature to today's presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. In order to make today's presentation accessible to as many people as possible, we are providing real-time captioning today. Much of the time, people use an online automated captioning service, which can be sufficient. But for today's presentation, Michelle Anderson is providing live captioning for today's event. Michelle specifically is providing CART real-time captioning. CART stands for Communication Access Real-Time Translation. Captioning is important for a number of reasons, especially including individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing, but it can also be advantageous to people who have unique learning styles, who prefer visual over audio. Also it can be essential for people who experience central auditory processing disorders. So thank you, Michelle.
And if anybody here hosts their own events, this is something that you can schedule to have for your event through the Disability Services Office, and we've included the email for you to reach out and get that service for your event. Ian, do you have a timeline of how long it takes to schedule CART for an event we can refer people to?
As early as possible is really important. There is a limited number of captioners and interpreters for that matter. A minimum of 2 weeks is required.
Great. Thanks for that context. So now we're going to introduce our panelists. Hala, will you start us off with introducing yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Halal Nabi. My pronouns are she, her. I am a Middle Eastern woman with long brown hair and brown eyes, and I'm wearing a gray shirt. I'm an associate professor at the Information School here at the UW. I'm a scholar practitioner. I have dedicated the last 20 plus years of my career working to understand and improve how organizations can better include and empower historically, institutionally marginalized groups. My work over the last 20 years have focused specifically on women and autistic people in the technology industry, but has broadened over the last few years. I'm neurotypical, and I want to say that I do not wish or claim to speak on behalf of neurodivergent people. My role on the panel when I speak is to share what I have learned from my research working with neurodivergent people and organizations that have been putting intentional effort in making their workplace inclusive of neurodivergent people. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I will pass it on to our next panelist.
Thank you, Hala. Next is Ian.
Hey, everyone. My name is Ian Campbell, and I manage the Disability Services Office for UW Human Resources. The DSO provides a number of services to the campus community, including employment accommodations for members of the public, remediation of barriers in the physical plant, as well as deaf and hard of hearing services. I have a 25-year career in disability services, including in a former life in student services, coordinating a program for autistic students, just to help them find the supports that they need in order to be successful. One other thing that I will say As manager of the Disability Services Office, I think accommodation is a really important part of including individuals with all types of disabilities. That being said, I recognize the shortcomings in the accommodation process, and that's where this work is so important, is, designing inclusive environments from the beginning rather than just focusing on accommodation.
Thanks, Ian. And off to you, Leslie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Clark, and my pronouns are they, them, and she, her. I am a white woman with brown hair and a ponytail, and I'm wearing a blue top. My role at the university is I'm the diversity recruiting consultant within professional and organizational development and UW HR. And basically what that means is that I'm here to help create and share best practices, collaborate around how to make hiring and onboarding more equitable and inclusive. I'm on this panel as a neurodivergent person. I will be speaking from partly from my own experience, but solely my individual experience as someone with ADHD, and I have comorbidities with anxiety and depression. But I'll also be speaking partly to as somebody involved in doing recruiting and onboarding work who is, I will say, active and still very much learning in the process of how to keep advancing what we do at the university for being a welcoming space for our current and future employees.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And Eli.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Jessica. My name is, sorry, I'm nervous. Hi everyone. So my name is Eli Heller. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I am the Student Services Manager for the Washington Space Grant Consortium, which is a scholarship program that is housed in the Astronautics and Aeronautics Department here in the College of Engineering. I've been working in higher education and student affairs for about 7 years. The last 3 have been here at the University of Washington. And I just recently transitioned to this role in September after serving as a career coach at the Career and Internship Center, where I help students individually with any career development topics that they requested: resumes, cover letters, interview practice, career exploration, so on and so forth. And I do a lot of that work now with the Space Grant Scholar population. So that's my role at the university. I identify as neurodivergent. I also identify as an adult with ADHD. I also identify as queer. I will be speaking also from my own experience, like Leslie. And I'm on this panel because, as I just shared, I actually am a neurodiverse person that was just recently onboarded. So I think that into a new role. So I think that I have some things that I can share about what makes that process challenging, but also what unique contributions neurodiverse employees can bring to any team in any department.
Thank you so much, Eli. And I'm Jessica Cole. I'm the director of Worklife, and I'm the host of this panel today. I'm here because I very deeply care about neurodivergent folks in my family, and I think this is really great work to do, especially with these panelists today. First, before we start into the questions for our panelists, I do want to go over some definitions because there's some words that we'll use in this event today that people may not be familiar with. Neurodiversity describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. And panelists, if you have stuff to add to these definitions, please feel free to jump in. I appreciate it. Neurotypical is the descriptor that refers to someone who has the brain functions, behaviors, and processing considered standard or typical, strong asterisk, according to cultural norms and social role expectations. Neurodivergence or neurodistinct is the term for people whose brains function differently in one or more ways that is considered standard or typical. Common types include autism, ADHD, dyslexia, bipolar disorder. We also are going to be using different ways of referring to folks who are neurodivergent, including people first language or identity community first language. This is a complicated topic, but I just want to have it as a definition. We're not going to go into which one is preferred or not because each individual prefers something different for themselves. People first language is, the term would be person with autism, if you're talking about someone who's on the autism spectrum. And identity/community first language, the term would be autistic person. And people, like I said, prefer it differently. I don't know if our panelists have any input on that one. And then we also want to acknowledge internalized ableism. Internalized ableism is when a person consciously or unconsciously believes the harmful messages they hear about disability and applies them to themselves. So that's also part of this discussion that we're having today. All right, and before we start, Eli's going to kick us off with some considerations about the content of this panel today.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to go ahead and start by sharing that when we talk about neurodiversity as we understand it today, it's really important to acknowledge that the neurodiversity movement and the neurodiversity paradigm really began within the autistic community and the autistic rights movement. And so, neurodiversity since then has expanded to include a lot more than just autistic identifying individuals. It includes ADHD identifying individuals, those with dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, bipolar, and a lot of other identities, as well as comorbidities, which Leslie mentioned. But I just do want to point out that it is important for us to understand that it all began with society as a whole having more conversations about specifically what autism spectrum and individuals experience and how to support them. So when we talk about neurodiversity, I want to acknowledge that none of the four of us are representing specifically an autistic perspective, but we want to acknowledge how important it is to honor that our discussion today wouldn't be possible if we hadn't initially had the autistic rights movement come up with the paradigm of neurodiversity in the first place.
Thank you so much, Eli. All right, on to our first question, panelists. And this is a two-part question. What are the biggest challenges for you as a neurodivergent adult onboarding to a new workplace or team? We'll start with that. And I'm hoping that Eli and Leslie, maybe you can provide some context of your personal experience with onboarding. And then if you can also include in that discussion, on the flip side, what are the unique strengths that you bring to your work team as a neurodivergent employee?
Happy to go first unless you want to go first, Leslie. Okay, so let's start with two-part question. Let's start with the biggest challenges. I would say that for me, as a neurodiverse person onboarding to a new workplace, one of the biggest challenges is understanding expectations and really making sure that I am learning at a pace that feels appropriate. Because for me personally, I'm a very bad judge of, it's very difficult for me to judge if I am learning at a pace that aligns with the expectations. And so I think that it can be really difficult sometimes to understand if the pace that I'm learning at is supporting the team and is where I feel like I need to be able to do my job well as I'm first learning a new job. I think another really big challenge is task management, especially when you're learning a new job. So one thing for folks with ADHD in particular is we have a really hard time switching tasks, especially when in my role, I have a lot of different types of tasks, and some of them involve directly serving students, and some of them involve kind of more project management and a lot of different projects. I have a lot of different projects that I work on that don't really have that much to do with each other. And so I think kind of figuring out how to switch tasks in a way that allows me to still get everything done can be really difficult when I'm first learning how to do certain tasks in the first place. I also think that, just the conversation about internalized ableism brings up the fact that a lot of adults with ADHD, and autism, or who are otherwise neurodiverse, really experience a lot of imposter syndrome in the workplace, even though we might have worked really hard to get where we are, because it takes more effort for us to do certain things. It can just be really hard to feel good about that if you don't have if you don't connect with your neurodiverse identity, or if you're not aware of it. So I think one thing that Leslie and I share is we both were diagnosed as adults. So I think I experienced a lot of imposter syndrome prior to my diagnosis, and I think that that's also a really big challenge when you're new in a workplace and you're trying to meet expectations and do everything correctly. It can be really hard to not be overly hard on yourself with unrealistic expectations of yourself. And on the flip side, as far as strengths, so like I said, my background is in student affairs, and to work in student affairs, it's really important to show a lot of empathy, to really support students individually and show that you care. And I think that because I relate to things like anxiety and imposter syndrome and uncertainties and having difficulty with making decisions, those are all things that undergrads experience a lot of. And so I feel like my strength that comes from my neurodivergence is really just a deep empathy for the students that I work with, and really knowing, feeling like I can really support them because I relate to some of the things that they experience with some of those challenges. And I would also say creativity. A lot of folks who are neurodiverse have really just a talent with when it comes to being imaginative and having a sense of humor and being creative. And I think that for me, also being in this kind of student affairs space, it is a more creative space than I think some people realize. And I can come up with ideas for workshops or for projects. And I think that my work my role is a good fit for me because of my creativity, which I think is because of my neurodiverse identity. Thanks for listening. Thanks,
Eli. I definitely relate with a lot of that. So for context, I started at the university 10 months ago. I started in March of this year. And I had previously been working for myself. And so it was a transition of being, within the past couple of years diagnosed with ADHD, and kind of figuring out the skills and strategies that were working for me, and then transitioning into like what I will call a more traditional workforce setting. I hadn't been back in an office in a really long time, which I think a lot of people empathize with. But I also I've never worked in a cubicle before. And so I wasn't totally sure of like the challenges that I was gonna have or what they might be. I think when Eli kind of spoke about the expectations, a lot of it for me, or some of the things that can be challenging, I think, is that in many places, like every culture has norms and rules, and some of those things are unspoken. So when you're getting your tour around the office, they'll show you where people's offices are. They'll sort of, they'll show you where to find the office supplies. They'll introduce you to your team. But there are just some things that don't really get covered. So we operate now, like in the modern workplace, in a lot of different spaces. We interact face-to-face, we interact on Zoom, we interact in chats. And so it's like, well, what's the decorum for the Teams chat? Like, is this all professional? Or if I drop a meme in there, is that going to be seen as inappropriate? Or is that like, okay? Like, what are the okay ways for me to express myself that sometimes you just have to gather through observation? And so I tend to be, when I get really comfortable somewhere, like pretty animated and loud and more boisterous. And a lot of the times when I'm in a new space, I'll engage in more of my masking behaviors. So masking behaviors are sort of, for those that might not know, are just sort of things that you use to sort of cover some of the traits that might be perceived as like not just more like neurotypical or more commonplace. So things for me that I sort of have to be aware of are things that are just common. Like, I'm not super inclined towards small talk. And so it's like reminding myself of, like, when people come in, you greet, you say hi, you do the engaging thing. Because I would probably just sit at my desk and zone out at my computer, but I'm like, okay, yes, you have to do this. Or things like interrupting, like interrupting is something that I think a lot of people might empathize with if they're ADHD or neurodivergent. But within the space that I work, especially in a DEI space, it's like I might have that tendency, but I also have to be really aware too that like I take up space and power, and interrupting can also be, even if I'm not coming from an intentional space of like trying to take up space, and it's coming because I'm connecting and engaging and like vibing with somebody, that like that actually does indicate other, like that's an indicator of power that I also have to be aware of. And so yeah. In terms of, I guess, the strengths, I think adaptability is a big one. So I think for one reason, like I've done a lot of different things. I absolutely feel like an imposter a lot of the time, because if you looked at my resume, you would probably wonder how I ended up here, but I think I'm pretty solid at my job. But as a result of like having to be adaptable, being really interest-based. So like if I get bored with something, it's really hard for me to engage with it. I have to keep looking for new strategies and ways of doing things. Like I think of the top two strengths I probably have are helping people and problem solving. And so being able to be somebody who, you know, not 100% of the time, context is really important for me, but to take on something like a roadblock and say, what are we going to do next? What are we going to do next? Because I'm very used to having a strategy, having a game plan, and being like the strategy we were using to get work done is not working anymore. We have to get like the toolbox out and figure out how you're going to keep things going, you know, for the next round until that stops working. So, yeah.
Jessica, may I comment on something as well?
Oh, please do.
This is maybe a good opportunity to plug a managerial strategy called strength-based leadership. You know, focusing on building your team around your team members' strengths while helping them to compensate for challenges that may exist in the workplace. I think it's a really good way to run a team in general. I think it can be especially beneficial for neurodivergent employees. And if anyone's interested in researching more about it, there's a book published by Gallup called Strength-Based Leadership.
Yeah, definitely agree with the strength-based leadership approach. And, you know, being a former career coach too, I think you learn that there isn't just good and bad, or like people have different strengths, right? Everyone has strengths and challenges. Like that's something that, yeah, I agree that I think that all managers should be able to recognize in their direct reports. I unmuted also because I do want to share just a couple more specific things that I think that are just important to say about what are some of the challenges that neurodiverse people face. I would say one of them is also memory, because with certain things, it's very hard. Like if I have to know something once, like when I get my computer set up or I get my figure out how files are organized. I mean, that's an example of a task that is on the tedious side. And sometimes for folks with ADHD in particular, it's like, it's just hard to retain that information because I don't need to know it every single day necessarily, only when I'm first starting. But if a couple months go by and then I have to pull something out of a specific place, or do something technical, I'm just not probably going to remember how to do it, and I might have to ask again, which brings me to another point. If I have to ask my manager or a coworker the same question more than once, it doesn't mean that I wasn't listening to begin with. It just means that I wasn't able to retain the information, but I do care. So I'm saying that to anybody that does have direct reports, because I have been so paranoid so many times that that someone is going to think that that my manager or whoever is going to think that I wasn't listening to them or didn't care. Chances are it just takes more than once to really retain the information, especially if it's not knowledge that I have to draw upon every single day. So those are just a couple more things I wanted to add. And actually, I'll just say one more thing. Time blindness, you might have also heard of time blindness. If someone's late to a meeting, they might have time blindness. They might not care or be late because I'm going to go ahead and say that probably 9 times out of 10, it's not because they don't care. It's because they aren't able to judge how long certain tasks will take them, or they aren't able to switch tasks fast enough because switching tasks is so hard. So they have to finish what they're doing and then they might join a meeting. And if that means they're a minute late, sometimes that just happens, and it doesn't mean they're a bad employee. So that's all.
All right, very thoroughly done. Thank you so much, panelists. I'm going to move on to the second question. What is the purpose of onboarding? And this is open to all the panelists.
Maybe I'll take a stab at this and kind of follow some of the themes that we've discussed so far. I think I really appreciate the perspectives that were shared, and they really get to the heart of the purpose of onboarding is to, to really help not only the new person coming into the team, but also the team to create some alignment and understanding of who we are, what do we bring to work, and how can we create a collaborative space where people can bring their talents to work in a way that is conducive and healthy for them. And that kind of creates, perhaps we can talk about it in 3 dimensions. In one dimension, it's what do I need to know about my role, how the team works, how the organization works, and what does the team need to know about me and how I work? Because it's a calibration and it's kind of a 2-way conversation. What are some of the written rules? Those can be easily accessible, hopefully, most of the time, and I can access them when I need them. But there's so many unwritten rules, and those can be really hard for, in my research, we found that a lot of the norms and the hidden subtleties of what's expected and what's not, who communicates about what's, how often, what are the important tasks versus the less important tasks, those are not always clear and they need to be made more explicit. So understanding those components and having a manager and perhaps team members being aware of that and contributing to bringing people along to understand those nuances would be really helpful. I saw in the chat, someone said that their boss within the first 3 days, their hiring manager showed them how to share emojis, because emojis are a big part of how the team connects. Those, nuances, norms are really, really important. The other thing is building relationships is a very important part of onboarding, because relationships give access to what people need to know about the work. Who do I go to when I really have trouble with this task? Building those relationships are sometimes easier for certain types of people versus others. For example, and this is for neurodivergent and neurotypical people. Some people have a lot more comfort with going up to someone and asking them for coffee. For others, that creates a lot of anxiety, or it's not as easy or natural for them to create those relationships. So how does the team and the manager help establish what are some really important relationships and maybe time and space for that? That becomes even more important in a space where we have, at the UW, we have virtual work as well as in-person work. And sometimes we forget about our virtual colleagues who are not in the office space as much. So how do we create those relationships in this environment? And I think the last thing I want to comment on something Eli said quite a bit. A very important part of onboarding is having regular feedback, right? So one of the purpose of onboarding is constantly calibrating of these are the things that we really appreciate and expect. Feedback is not just about when things are not going well. Feedback is also about here are things that are going well. The last thing I want to say about onboarding, and this is kind of one of the beauties of working in a diverse workplace, whether it's a neurodiverse workplace, racially, gender diverse workplaces, whenever we bring people in, they have different perspectives. And we're not only one thing, we are multiple, we have multiple identities and we bring different strengths and perspectives. So I would love to emphasize that onboarding, when it comes to onboarding neurotypical or neurodivergent new team members, it's about learning. It's not just about assimilating the person to fit our norms only. It's what can we learn to do better or differently because we have this new opportunity. And it's not just about the task, it's also about, hey, are there better ways for us to communicate with each other? So if we're in a meeting and we're taking a lot of really complex tasks, should we assign someone to take notes and to have an agreed set of skills or tasks and who's going to do what before we leave? because that can get confusing and we might not have this. So are we on the same page? There are a lot of opportunities in the onboarding phase to calibrate the team to create certain activities, whether it's who's going to take notes this meeting so we all agree, or taking 5 minutes at the end of the meeting to say, here are some of the things that we really want. Another really important aspect of that onboarding and feedback is having it be regular, not just part of the evaluation process, right? It's like weekly, standard meetings. How is everybody doing? Thumbs up, thumbs down on how are people doing? And then the people who are not doing well, maybe I reach out to them and see what's happening, or a team member does. So onboarding is about creating that alignment and calibration of new ways of doing things that are inclusive of the different ways of effective collaboration and communication that different people bring. I will stop here and
I'll chime in, and Hala, I always appreciate your input. It's always so thorough and thoughtful. You know, it's been a long time since I've been onboarded. I've been at the university for 10 years, but I do hire and onboard with some frequency. And for me, it's about creating a safe culture which allows for people to communicate authentically. And I always feel like when there's enough safety, you know, and people are able to be vulnerable and express themselves authentically, that increases productivity. I think it has a way at times of sort of bonding a team, and I think it also allows for teams to be more resilient as they experience adversity, because I think that happens. Yeah, I'll stop there.
If I may add something to what Ian mentioned, and a quick question in the chat. There are very simple frameworks to surface some of these tendencies and preferences. I have a simple framework that I use with my teams whenever a new member comes in, and sometimes just regularly, around communication preferences, work preferences, personality preferences. Everyone knows I'm incredibly social. I have to work with food around, and I have to think out loud, right? Those are the kinds of things sometimes, like, I think Rebecca is here. One of my colleagues will say, Hala, I know you want to talk about this, but I really need to get this done. So let's brainstorm somewhere else. So there are some frameworks, and I'm happy to share the one I have to create some of these alignment questions, right? There's no one way for every team or every person, but there are a set of criteria or questions that we can ask around communication, work preferences, prioritizing, time, that you could surface some of these unique needs and preferences and honor them in explicit ways.
I really appreciate that sort of that framework, Hala, because I think that's one of the things, onboarding is really, I think it's a give and take. From one side, it's like, we're this huge institution, we have lots of information. One of the first things I was told off the bat is it'll probably take you at least 3 years to learn everything there is to learn about the university, which is pretty intimidating. But also it's about setting your team member up for success. And one of the things I think about that I was asked that I didn't even necessarily know how to answer was what's the best way we can support you? And I think framing that question potentially around those specific things of like, how does it work for you? What's the best way for you to communicate? What's the best way, do you want to have a Teams call, like a Teams chat? Do you prefer email? Some people don't want to be, they're happy to respond to chat as they're going. Some people want to check their email at certain times of the day so they don't get distracted by the task. And it's conditional, but I think it helps folks feel like, especially as many of us, like it can feel, many of us at the university have, exist in some kind of hybrid space. So there's a lot of folks that were called back into work and just the reality is like when you're in an office, you don't have as much autonomy over your space. You don't have as much control. And so giving folks, there's definitely folks that are neurodiverse that thrive working in office environments. I'm not one of them. I find it incredibly distracting. And so it's like, well, what are the things I can do to set it up so that I'm actually getting the most out of this face time with people on my team, but I'm also able to be as productive as I want to be. So I think sometimes just managers getting more specific and thinking about that framework about how can they be asking the question differently. Just because, like, in all honesty, I didn't even know when I started what support could look like. You know, it's I think that, like, when folks come with certain skills, it's like for many folks, it's not a skills deficit, it's a support deficit. So like, how do we support people being able to utilize their skills? And be open to the idea that the support might not look like something we've encountered before, but it doesn't mean that they're like a problem employee or need more than other employees do.
And you know, this is also a really timely conversation for us at the UW, as we are thinking and rethinking what does work and telework and hybrid agreements look like. And if you read in the literature, especially the HR literature and the practice, what's happening is focusing on, you know, end goals versus specific ways where we traditionally have created work spaces and who should do work when and how. That really opens us up to being more productive, reduce turnover, reduce burnout, and get the best out of folks. Like Leslie, if I'm in the office, I'm constantly distracted, and I love that, but I'm less productive. But if I work a few hours at home or a couple of days at home, I can get my tasks done in a much deeper way. And that, you know, and that will be a lot more productive for the organization rather than me coming in from 8 to 5. So I would encourage all of us, managers, colleagues, not only to really think about how we change that work, but our perceptions, even for those of our colleagues who have those accommodations, sometimes their commitment gets questioned. So questioning our own assumptions about how work should be done, who should do it, and why and how, versus the end goal of the task or the activity would be really helpful in this conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll just go ahead and add something to that and just say that, you know, for me personally, I actually don't, for the most part, prefer to work at home because that's where I'm not in a designated workspace, right? And I would never accept a job that was 100% remote. That just would not work for me. It would be very, very hard to get the work done completely from home every day. Like, I like coming to a place that isn't the same place where I have my, you know, home life, right? To get work done and to just be out of that space is like having that separation. I feel like I really need that to be my most productive self as an employee.
I think that really beautifully illustrates. I think one of the general takeaways is, like, when you've talked with one neurodiverse person, you've talked with one neurodiverse person. So Eli and I have completely opposite ideal work situations. And to be fair, mine changes, like, you know, but I think that's one of those things of, like, I think the point about sort of being curious and asking questions and looking at the things that you assume. So if you're like, a lot of folks will be like, you know, in a meeting, we really want to have cameras on. We really want everybody engaged. And, like, as a facilitator, someone who facilitates and teaches, I totally get, like, wanting to see faces, wanting to have connection. I need that person head nodding. But at the same time, as someone with anxiety and someone that feels like they have to show up and perform in the workplace a very particular way, it's oftentimes like that's the level, that's the emotional labor of, like, showing up professionally, physically, that can be challenging and isn't always a possibility if you're dealing with something, or it's just that day that you can't do that. That's not like my norm isn't everybody's norm. So I have to think outside of that of, you know, is it a need or is it a preference?
All right. Thank you, panelists, for your answers to that question. We're going to move on to the next question. And I think a lot of this has already come up in your discussion already, but it is worth asking the question, what questions should we ask of our team members?
I mean, I'll throw one out. You know, I think early on, I think it's best practice to ask new team members how they would like to be introduced to the rest of the team. You know, it may be common practice to introduce a new member of the team to a larger departmental group, and some people may be energized by that. Other people may experience a great deal of anxiety over having to sort of present on who they are, and it may be better for some employees to be introduced by email or, you know, in some other format. So that's one that I'll start with.
Maybe this would be a good moment for some lived experience from Leslie or Eli. What questions do you wish would have been asked whenever you recently onboarded? Or what questions did someone ask you that you found especially helpful?
Well, one thing that you also brought up, Leslie, which I was really glad you mentioned, is just the comorbidities. It actually is the norm, not the exception, for folks with ADHD in particular to also have anxiety or depression or both. And so you know, it would be nice to have a manager say something like, how are you feeling? How is this transition going for you? Is there anything that you want to kind of, someone brought up externally processing feelings and thoughts and reflections. I do that. And it helps to have a manager that allows me to just have a space to kind of externally process what I'm thinking, especially during a big, heavy transition. So that's what I would say.
And I think we already really mentioned, you know, communication styles, learning styles, like Eli was saying, you know, providing significant enough, you know, structure, finding out what that structure, the desired structure may look like for someone. Just a couple other thoughts.
One thing I think, I have a lot of thoughts about what could be helpful. I think one thing, especially for those that are in a position where they're working remotely or working hybrid, is thinking about like if possible, thinking about the flexibility of schedules. So I know something Hala kind of mentioned was like, we're thinking about work in a way of like, if you have a position that's not maybe super customer facing or client facing, is there a way to grant your employees flexibility in what their schedules look like? Something that I've experienced, and I think this probably varies a bit across the university, but I've noticed that there are spaces where even if I'm working remotely, there's an expectation that I'm sort of on Teams from 8 to 5. And to me, I'm like, well, that's not really flexible work, because like that's just basically being at a desk, but you're at home. And so I think for me, like I will go through phases where working really early in the morning works really well for me. I don't need my team to necessarily know, and nor do I want to bother them with emails at 3 a.m. So I will use a schedule send. But like, how can you make that work? Like, unless in my mind, it's like, unless it's creating bottlenecks, being able to support people working at the times that work for them without a fear that they're not working enough, because I think a lot of work should be tied towards what's that outcome thinking, like what are the outcomes versus what where are people physically or virtually reporting? And I recognize that that doesn't apply in every case and in every position, but I think that is, in general, flexibility about where and what time work can take place is really helpful for a lot of folks.
I just wanted to share that I just listed a few of those category spaces that are helpful to have conversations, open conversations about preferences and best ways of work, and then really get to the conversation of, your student facing, and students need, like a balance of in-person and virtual. So let's create an agreement that works for the role as well as you would be helpful. And I'm going to share a link to an assessment, a detailed assessment. It's really long. You don't have to use that entire one, where you can actually surface those questions in productive ways with your team members. Hopefully that will be helpful. But again, these are very detailed frameworks that you could scale to fit your context.
Any further comments before we move on to the next question? Perfect. Okay, we'll ask this final question and then we will go over takeaways and then open it up for questions from our, for those of you who are here. So have those questions ready. I see that the chat is very active and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. So the final question, when we were planning for this panel, everybody agreed that moments of transition were particularly important to understand. And so I ask you panelists, why are transitions so hard for neurodivergent folks?
It's because we thrive on predictability. And when we're not in a routine yet that we know works for us, and we're just trying to figure out what that is, it can be really difficult to also be making sure that we're meeting expectations, that we are building relationships with people and allocating time for that, while we're also trying to learn a lot of things and retain all the information, right? So there's just a lot going on in the transition, and it can be really overwhelming, I think, for neurodiverse folks who already have just additional sensitivities to certain stimuli. So that's the reason that I would say. And then I would also say, because we notice I would say this might also be true for autistic folks. I might walk into a room, into a new space, into a new office, and just notice every single thing that is different at all times, and it can just overwhelm my brain. And because I'm noticing every single change, because I thrive so much on predictability and routine and sameness to a certain extent. Because if I know how something is going to go, there's nothing to be anxious about, right? So I know hopefully, I think there are some folks probably in the audience that that can sort of relate to what I'm saying. But yeah, those are some of the reasons that that it's hard for me.
I think one of the things that can be difficult too is I think anybody that maybe feels like they have something extra that they're bringing to the table, it's like you don't have an inherent level of trust built with anyone. So it's like, if I'm talking with my supervisor, I don't know if maybe they do have an awareness of neurodiversity, maybe they don't. Maybe they have really strong preferences about how things have traditionally been done within their unit or department, maybe they don't. And so it's sort of evaluating that, like, is this going to be risky? Is this, does it feel like I can bring this up, and how quickly? And because you're also trying, like, everybody that starts a new job is trying to impression manage. Like, I think even those of us who live out loud, as it were, probably like mitigate some of that on the first day. But it's like, if I tell somebody without a lot of context for who I am, because we haven't spent a lot of time working together, that I really appreciate hard deadlines. That doesn't mean that I want to be micromanaged. It just means that this is a fun tool that I use because I need external accountability. And I just have to have like a date that I know I need to have it done by, because if it's nebulous, it'll be the 3-year, filing project or organizing project that never gets done. So yeah, I think a lot of that too, and I think Ian spoke to this, is just like, there's a lot of things that are going to be beneficial for setting up success for neurodiverse people that are going to benefit everybody, but really showing up with that empathy of like, even if there's something that you don't understand or you're not familiar with, of like having the empathy to just be like, we're going to figure out how to work with this. Like, I don't think like, I don't know like that anybody necessarily comes. I think finding the balance is like finding the balance where even if you don't know, you're still trying, and that folks don't feel like so scared that they just don't want to bring it up, and don't bring awareness of things that are helpful for you, for you in this dynamic to know the whys of potentially.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that you mentioned impression. I hadn't heard that phrase before, impression management, Leslie, but that is so true. And, oftentimes because we have imposter syndrome, we tend to be perfectionists, or we tend to be people pleasers because we're trying to impression manage in a way that is meeting expectations. And for me, I always perceive that I'm behind, even if I'm not behind. And so I don't want anyone to think that I'm behind. And so I might start to people please, or I might start to do things in a way that, makes it seem like I won't ever make a mistake that anybody notices, right? And it's just, and then when you think about that, it's like, well, okay, of course, this is why we're anxious, because, and this is why all of that is heightened when we're new somewhere, because we haven't built relationships yet, we haven't made impressions yet, we don't know what people's impressions of us are yet, and that matters to us, because we want, like for me, it's like I want feedback because I want to make sure that I'm meeting expectations, because I want to make sure that I'm doing a good job, because I tend to think that I tend to fear that I might not be because I didn't understand something. So it's all very real.
Totally. I think it's really hard to, especially when you're starting and you want to appear as competent as you can, to be like, I bring all these really unique strengths, but like I open my jacket and I have this bag of tricks of like weird things that are like, I'm figuring out how to manage. And it's like, I don't really want to put all of that on the table right away to show you like, there's a other side to that coin, and you're going to learn about it, like no matter what. But I think that just too has to do a lot with work culture of like, we can't expect expecting perfection is really hard. Like everybody's going to have something, and I believe like it's better to know the uncomfortable thing than to not know, but safety and trust is a part of having that conversation. I had another thought, but I kind of lost it.
So we're 5 minutes before the end of the event. And as much as this is such a great conversation about transitions, and I hate to cut in, I do want to transition into our next slide, which is about the 4 key takeaways from this event that we want to send you with today. One is recognize and honor that transitions are difficult for some folks and leave space for that. 2, onboarding is about creating alignment, which is a common ground with clear expectations between the team. Provide clear instructions and expectations for folks who are coming into the team. And it sounds like in the panel also regularly providing that as things change. 3, when possible, be flexible in how we onboard employees. Take into consideration people's preferences. Ask the questions, for example, what's your preferred way to do this thing? Don't make assumptions about what people prefer or need. We often project what we think people will need, which isn't always the case. Number 4, be curious about the different neurotypes on your team and learn about them without depending on your team members. So be curious. If you learn about a new neurotype, do some Googling and just learn a little bit about what other people's experiences are. And now that we've had those 4 takeaways, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Nicole, did you want to select a question to ask? I think we'll only have time for 1. I know that's a lot of pressure.
If we have time, there were 2. One was about organizations on campus serving both staff and faculty. I mentioned the Huskies for Neurodiversity, which is primarily a student organization. So if any of you know about something or something in its nascent stages, jump in. But I think the biggest question that came up in several forms during the course of the talk was about safety in bringing up these issues with coworkers, colleagues, supervisors. So it can oftentimes be very difficult to disclose neurodiversity and other disabilities because of fear of discrimination. What ways can managers or leadership be visible about safety for people to disclose?
You know, I'll contribute sort of from a compliance perspective, really an ADA compliance perspective. You know, employees do not have an obligation to disclose to their employer, and many people who, you know, identify as neurodivergent don't always identify with a specific diagnosis. They may not fully validate the existing diagnosis, and you know, it's okay not to disclose. You know, obviously the Disability Services Office is always a resource if someone does want to seek confidential discussion and has an interest in requesting a formal accommodation in the workplace. You know, we're always here. We frequently also just have consultations with individuals without the need to formally engage in the formal accommodations process.
I'll say a couple of quick things because this is actually a really important question, but a really complex one as well. I think the first one is establishing trust. If you are a team member or a leader that wants to establish trust for people to share their identified identity and their needs, it's important to set the tone for wanting to listen, confidentiality, and taking the person's lead on what they want to do with that information and how they want you and the team to respond to it as well. The way we receive that information is by also not starting to assume and start to invest in all kinds of different practices or implementations that are not necessarily the preference of the person. So just quickly to say how we respond in confidentiality, trust, continuing to focus on strength, and taking the person's lead is step 1. And if you'd like more information about that, I actually have a couple of resources I will send as well, because I know we're running out of time.
I just wanted to quickly add, I think if I'm being redundant in this first part, I'm sorry, but like if you're in a situation, like sometimes it's uncertain, but sometimes it's uncomfortability, as like if you feel like it's not a possibility for whatever reason to bring this up in a safe way to your supervisor or manager, they don't have to have awareness of you getting, if you decide to go the route of an accommodation. And also identifying who your HRC is, your human resources coordinator. If there's a situation you're just not really sure how to navigate or how to start that conversation, those folks are there to be a resource around that, to help you figure out the best way to accomplish the things you want to accomplish, even if that doesn't feel like a conversation that you're ready to have at that point.
We are at time. Thank you so much to our panelists. I really, really, truly appreciate you being here and sharing your experiences, your expertise, and everything that you bring to the table. I think I speak on behalf of all the participants, as I'm seeing in the chat right now, that everyone in the UW community is appreciative of you being here today and sharing with us. I invite the panelists to stay afterwards for a few minutes if they have the time for any questions that come up. I asked Nicole to take the recording off so that people can ask candid questions as folks are leaving.